We begin part 3 of chapter 2 by reviewing short-run versus long-run elasticities. We need to also distinguish between the short-run and long-run when viewing how much time passes before measuring changes in the quantity demanded and quantity supplied. The long run is a time period that allows enough time to pass for either producers or consumers to fully adjust to price changes. So let us begin with demand. You will find that the demand for many goods is more price elastic in the long run because it takes consumers time to change behaviors. In the first example, we are going to examine the short run and long run demand curves for gas or petrol in our case. And this is figure 2.14. So in the short run, you can see that the demand curve is fairly steep, so that is relatively inelastic. However, in the long run tends to be a flatter curve and is more elastic. So in the short run, if there is a if there is an increase in price, it has only a small effect on the quantity of petrol or gasoline demanded, and that is given by the relatively inelastic shape of this demand curve. So in terms of consumers or motorists changing their behavior, in the short run, they may adapt their behavior to some extent, but not to such a great an extent such as changing their car, for instance. However, in the long run, because they have a longer time period to adjust, if there is an increase in the price of gasoline, in the long run, they may decide to purchase more fuel-efficient cars that are run lighter on petrol, for instance. And that is demonstrated by a flatter long-run demand curve, because it is more elastic in the long run than in the short run. And this tends to be the case for many goods and services. However, for goods that are more durable, the opposite is again true. So if we look at the durability of goods, here we're thinking about goods such as cars, your appliances like fridges, stoves, furniture, or capital equipment. Those are your durable goods. And there we find that in the short run demand curve is more elastic than the long run. So we're going to consider an example here for cars or automobiles, and you'll see that the short run demand curve is more elastic, right, versus the long run demand curve for automobiles. And this is due to the nature of the good being more durable. So if the price were to increase, you would find that consumers in the short run would defer their purchases of new cars, meaning they would try to delay buying new cars in the short run. Thus, the annual quantity demanded would fall. However, in the long run, we know that a car is an asset that depreciates, it wears out, and at some point it must in fact be replaced. So hence, in the long run, you find that you have more inelastic long-run demand curve for automobiles. And that is demonstrated by the shape of the curve. So income elasticities also differ in the short run to the long run. For most goods and services, such as your food, your fuel, entertainment, etc., the income elasticity of demand is larger in the long run than the short run. So if you consider the fuel example, for instance, if we were to experience a sustained period of economic growth and incomes rises, you may find that consumers may change behavior and engage in more frequent road trips, taking long journeys, consuming more petrol as a result of that sustained period of income increases, changing their consumption. Hence, in the long run, the income elasticity of demand is larger. right? However, for durable goods, that is again the opposite. The short-run elasticity of demand will be more responsive or larger than the long run. And here you can return to the example of a durable good such as a car, where if income, let's say, increased by 10%, the total stock of cars demanded would rise. It would mean a much higher increase in current purchases. But after that stock is rebuilt, new purchases are mainly to just replenish or replace old cars. Next, we'll move on to cyclical industries. Now, cyclical industries are industries where the sales typically magnify cyclical changes in GDP. So, if we think about the demand for durable goods, for instance, that will fluctuate in response to short-run changes in income. So you'll find that these industries are more vulnerable to business cycle fluctuations. So in ECO152, you would have learned about your business cycle, and you know that business cycle fluctuations are the patterns of upswing and downswing of economic activity over a period of time. So these cyclical industries typically magnify these cyclical changes in GDP. So if we have a look at the next two figures, figure 2.15 and 2.16, it will demonstrate this. So figure 2.15 shows you GDP, or gross domestic product, the growth rate, the annual percentage, and investment by firms in durable equipment, right? So here you can see that in fact the industry is cyclical and it's tracking the pattern of GDP, but notice that it is in fact magnifying these upswings and downswings quite considerably. Because in the short run, GDP elasticity of demand is larger than the long run elasticity of demand for long-lived capital investment. So that is your more durable capital investment. So those changes in investment in equipment will magnify the changes in GDP. Hence, we'd consider these industries cyclical industries. Figure 2.16 compares the consumption of durables, such as consumer durable goods like the automobiles, appliances, furniture, and consumer expenditure on non-durable goods like clothing, services, and food, to annual growth rates for GDP. And like the previous example where capital equipment industries, these industries that produce consumer durables are also cyclical. So you will see that the durables, the changes in GDP are magnified in these industries. So for instance, sales of cars, your electrical appliances, they are strongly affected by macroeconomic conditions. And the same cannot be said for your non-durables. You can see that they do not magnify the changes in GDP. And this all comes down to short-run and long-run demand elasticities. Hence, it is important to understand the difference between short-run and long-run elasticities and how both income as well as the nature of the good in terms of durability can affect these. Let's turn our attention to supply and durability. So elasticities of supply also differ from long run and short run. For most products, the long run supply is more price elastic than the short run. In figure 2.17a, we see the supply of primary copper as shown in part A, and it is more elastic in the long run. If price increases, firms would be more likely to produce more, but are limited to do so by capacity constraints in the short run. However, in the longer run, they are able to add capacity and produce more. right? And that is what is demonstrated by these two curves. The constrained capacity in the short run, in terms of expanding production if price increases, versus in the long run, the ability to expand production due to those price increases. So in the longer run, they can add more capacity and produce more. In the second part of this figure, we have what we see is the secondary copper market. And here there is a difference in the short run and long run supply curves. For certain goods, the supply may be more elastic in the short run. For example, durable, recycled goods like scrap metal, for instance, secondary copper. So if there are price increases, there is a greater incentive to convert scrap copper that may be readily available into new supply. So initially, there is a secondary supply from scrap metal and it increases sharply, hence the more elastic short-run supply curve. However, that supply will contract in the long run. So the stock of scrap falls in the secondary supply market. So hence in the long run, in this particular market, it is less elastic in the long run than in the short run. Lastly, this example 2.7 for the price of Brazilian coffee. I would prefer that you also work through these examples in your own time to consolidate your knowledge. We will continue with section 2.6 in part